I stepped off the plane with sand still in my boots and a duffel that smelled like diesel and rain. By sunset, a courier handed me an emergency summons with my father's name stamped across it in ink that bled. He was suing me for corporate sabotage at the company I had bled to protect from half a world away. I did not cry. I unpacked my uniform, pressed the creases flat, and planned a different kind of operation. My name is Mara Ellison. I'm 31 years old. The city of Northcrest was weeping, a steady, miserable drizzle that blurred the world into gray streaks on the taxi window. It was a damp, clinging cold that had nothing on the dry, honest chill of the Baltic highlands I'd just left. Through the smeared glass, the Aegis Meridian Systems headquarters rose like a shard of black ice, its name a familiar wound etched in brushed steel. The rain ran down the sign, making the letters bleed light across the polished granite facade, a perfect reflection of the city's indifferent sky. This was home, or it had been. The cab driver said nothing as he pulled up to my apartment building, a brick monolith that had stood here since before I was born. He just took my money, his eyes avoiding mine in the rearview mirror as if he could sense the disquiet I carried with me. I hauled my duffel from the trunk, the strap digging into a shoulder that ached with the memory of body armor. The air smelled of wet asphalt and exhaust, a stark contrast to the scent of pine and aviation fuel that had been my world for the past year. My uniform, the collar of my service coat still holding the faintest, ghosting scent of cordite and gun oil, felt stiff and alien in this soft, civilian world. It was a skin I was no longer sure how to shed. Inside, the apartment was still and silent, a time capsule of the life I'd paused 12 months ago. Dust motes danced in the weak afternoon light slanting through the blinds. I dropped the duffel on the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet. I didn't unpack, not yet. I just stood in the center of the living room, letting the silence press in, trying to feel like I belonged here again. The feeling wouldn't come. My senses were still tuned to a different frequency, an operational tempo that made the stillness of this room feel like the breathless moment before an ambush. The knock on the door was sharp, a three-knuckle rap that cut through the silence like a gunshot. It wasn't the friendly tap of a neighbor, it was official, impatient. I opened the door to a man in a cheap rain jacket, his face impassive. He held a clipboard and a large, stiff envelope the color of a deep bruise. "Mara Ellison?" he asked, not as a question but as a confirmation. I nodded, my throat tight. He didn't need a signature. He simply pressed the envelope into my hand, the corners sharp against my palm, turned, and walked back into the rain without another word. I closed the door slowly, my fingers tracing the embossed seal on the back. The Superior Court of Northcrest County. My heart didn't race. It did something colder. It settled, heavy and dense in my chest, a block of ice. I carried it to the kitchen counter and slid it open with a paring knife, the movement precise and economical. The paper inside was thick, cream-colored, and covered in dense, black type. An emergency summons, a motion for a temporary restraining order, and then the names. Plaintiff, Conrad Ellison, CEO, Aegis Meridian Systems. Defendant, Mara Ellison. The air left my lungs in a silent rush. Conrad Ellison, my father. The words swam for a moment, refusing to connect. The man who had taught me how to sight a rifle, how to read a balance sheet, how to lead from the front. The man whose company I had just spent a year protecting from threats he couldn't even imagine. Running cyber supply chain risk assessments from a makeshift operations center while rockets fell a dozen clicks away. I forced my eyes down the page. Scanning the allegations, the language was sterile, brutal. Unauthorized access to proprietary source code repositories, willful disclosure of sensitive defense contract information to unauthorized third parties, actions constituting corporate sabotage and a direct threat to national security interests. It was a fantasy, a meticulously constructed lie. The repositories they mentioned were the ones I had helped design. The contracts were the ones my threat intelligence reports had helped secure. The accusations were so perfectly inverted, so precisely targeted at the core of my professional honor that they could only have been crafted by someone who knew exactly where to cut. My hand went to my phone, a reflex. I dialed his private number. It rang, each sterile tone an echo in the crushing silence of my apartment. One ring, two. I pictured him in his office on the 20th floor of that black tower, looking out at the rain, letting it ring. 3, 4. It clicked over to the familiar, impeccably modulated voice of his voicemail, but the message was new. "You've reached Conrad Ellison. I'm unavailable at the moment." A pause, and then, as if it were a calculated addendum just for me, his voice dropped slightly. "It's not personal, Mara. It's business." The click of the recording ending was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I lowered the phone, my fingers numb. It's business. He hadn't even given me the courtesy of a direct confrontation. He had left a message, a corporate epilogue to a father-daughter relationship, recorded and stored for my convenience. A cold dread, sharper than any fear I had felt on deployment, seeped into my bones. This wasn't a sudden, angry impulse. He had prepared this. The timing was too perfect, the legal language too polished. While I was packing my gear in a freezing NATO barracks, he was meeting with lawyers. While my plane was crossing the Atlantic, his courier was waiting for confirmation of my landing. He had used my service, my absence, as the staging ground for his attack. A switch flipped inside me. The shock, the hurt, the betrayal. It was all there, a white-hot core of pain. But my training, my entire life, had been about building firewalls around that core. You don't panic under fire. You assess, you plan, you act. I walked into my bedroom and finally unzipped the duffel bag. I didn't pull out civilian clothes. I took out my dress uniform, the one I had worn to my deployment ceremony. I laid it on the bed, smoothing the dark fabric. I took out my commendation medals, the polished metal cool to the touch, and the small, velvet-lined box that held my rank insignia. I arranged them carefully on my dresser, a neat, orderly line of my service, a life he was trying to erase. Then, I turned to my personal laptop. I powered it on, the screen casting a pale blue light in the dim room. My fingers moved across the keyboard with a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't searching for old photos or sentimental emails. I navigated to a secure backup drive and opened a folder labeled AMS Internal. Inside was a PDF copy of the Aegis Meridian Systems Corporate Policy and Employee Handbook, the version I had personally co-authored 2 years ago before the restructuring. I knew every clause, every subsection, especially the ones on intellectual property rights and the whistleblower protections I had fought to include. I had built the cage. Now I needed to see if he had left the key in the lock. With the handbook open on one side of the screen, I opened a new browser tab. My search was specific. JAG Assistance, Northcrest. I found the number for the Regional Military Legal Services Office. I needed to know my rights, not as an employee, but as a returning service member under the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act, USERRA, an acronym that was about to become my primary weapon system. I made the call, my voice steady, providing my name, rank, and situation in clipped, professional tones. The lawyer on the other end was quiet, listening, taking notes. An appointment was made for 0800 tomorrow. When the call was over, I stood up and walked to the full-length mirror on the closet door. The woman looking back was a stranger. The fatigue from the flight was etched under her eyes, her face pale in the gloom, but the eyes themselves were different. The softness was gone. The warmth, the easy affection I had always reserved for my father, had been extinguished. All that remained was a hard, cold clarity. I was no longer looking at a daughter who had just come home. I was looking at an intelligence officer who had just been handed a new mission dossier. The battlefield was my own life. The primary adversary was my own blood, and the rules of engagement had just been dictated in a language of pure, calculated betrayal. The operation had already begun. The next morning, I walked into the lobby of Aegis Meridian Systems not as a daughter or a senior strategist, but as a defendant. The air was cool, and smelled of industrial cleaner and expensive. Phantom coffee. Nothing had changed, and yet everything was different. To my right, the enormous backlit slogan I had helped choose years ago blazed with sanctimonious blue light. Integrity first. It was mounted on a wall of black marble so polished you could see your reflection in it, a distorted funhouse version of yourself. Directly beneath this grand statement of corporate ethics, the primary keycard scanner for the main security gate was malfunctioning. An employee, his face a mask of weary frustration, repeatedly swiped his badge, producing a series of angry negative beeps. A harried-looking security guard was waving people through a side gate with a manual clicker, his expression a perfect portrait of apathy. For 2 weeks, I'd later learn, the gatekeeper of a multi-million-dollar defense contractor had been broken. Integrity first, security whenever we get around to it. The irony was so thick it was almost a physical presence. I didn't need to be waved through. The temporary access card they'd couriered to me, a bland, white plastic rectangle with no photo, a visitor's pass in my own company, granted me a single, affirmative chime. As I walked toward the elevator bank, a voice, smooth and oiled as a new firearm, slid into step beside me. "Mara, welcome home. We heard you were back. A triumph for the company. A true patriot's return." I turned. Pierce Latham, the new chief financial officer. I'd met him once, briefly, a week before my deployment. He had the kind of aggressive, predatory tan that didn't come from the sun, but from a high-end salon, and teeth so white they looked like a threat. He was a numbers man, brought in to optimize shareholder value, which was my father's preferred euphemism for gutting departments he deemed inefficient. "Pierce," I said, my voice flat. We stepped into an empty elevator, the doors closing to encase us in brushed steel and recessed lighting. As we ascended, he leaned in conspiratorially, his cologne overpowering. "Just finished the preliminary quarterly review," he whispered, as if sharing a state secret. "The profit margins on the Sentinel project are celestial, absolutely celestial. Conrad is a visionary. The board will be ecstatic." He was talking about my project, the one I had designed from the ground up. He spoke of it as if it were a recently discovered oil field, a natural resource to be fracked and monetized, entirely detached from the mind that had conceived it. I said nothing, just watched the floor numbers climb. He didn't seem to notice my silence, lost in a devotional trance. "The efficiencies we've implemented in your absence have really streamlined the asset-to-revenue pipeline." The doors opened onto the 17th floor, the home of the Strategic Threat Analysis Division, my division. He finally seemed to register my stony expression. "Well," he said, his smile faltering for a microsecond. "Good to have you back on the team." He strode out, already pulling his phone from his pocket, no doubt to gaze lovingly at a spreadsheet. The 17th floor felt wrong. The layout was different. The open-plan workspace I had championed, replaced with a maze of frosted glass partitions that broke sightlines and muffled conversation. People looked up as I walked through, their eyes widening for a moment before they quickly looked back down at their screens. Whispers followed me like a static charge. They weren't hostile, not exactly. They were nervous. The air was thick with the quiet paranoia of a recent purge. I heard fragments, snippets of conversations that died as I drew near. Complete restructure. The whole original team is gone. Happened right after she left. My old office, a corner space with a view of the North Crest skyline, was now occupied by a sprawling fern and 2 leather armchairs. It had been converted into an informal meeting space. A sign on the door read, "Synergy Hub." I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. Of course it did. A junior analyst I barely recognized, a young woman with anxious eyes, pointed me toward my new assigned workspace. It wasn't an office. It wasn't even a cubicle. It was a single, narrow desk, a cheap laminate afterthought, shoved between 2 towering, beige filing cabinets from the last century. They smelled of old paper and dust. One cabinet was for active personnel files. The other, I knew, was for terminated employees. I had been placed, quite literally, between the present and the past, in a purgatory of metal and manila folders. It wasn't a mistake, it was a message, as subtle as a boot to the throat. You are temporary, you are an artifact, you are already filed away. I was still taking in my new, cramped reality when my father's executive assistant appeared. Mara, Conrad would like to see you. He's addressing the senior staff in the main conference room. He wants to welcome you home personally. Her smile was brittle, her eyes holding a carefully neutral expression that I recognized as fear. The walk to the conference room was the longest of my life. I felt every eye on me. I was no longer a leader here. I was a spectacle. The conference room was packed, all the division heads and senior managers standing with coffee cups in hand. My father stood at the head of the long, polished table, looking every inch the CEO. His suit was immaculate, his posture ramrod straight, his silver hair catching the light. He was a man carved from authority. He saw me enter and his face broke into a broad, public smile. Ah, there she is, our returning hero. The room erupted in polite, obligatory applause. He gestured for me to stand beside him, a piece of corporate theater for the masses. I moved to his side, my muscles rigid, the smell of his aftershave, a scent that had meant safety and home for my entire childhood, now smelled like deceit. As you all know, he began, his voice resonating with practiced confidence, my daughter, Mara, has spent the last year serving our country with distinction on a critical NATO assignment. She embodies the values we hold dear at Aegis Meridian: commitment, resilience, and a dedication to protecting our nation's interests. He placed a hand on my shoulder. It felt unnaturally heavy, a brand. Her work overseas has been invaluable, and we are all thrilled to have her back, bringing that battlefield-tested grit back to the boardroom. He spoke about me as if I were a new piece of military hardware the company had acquired. Throughout the entire speech, a masterclass in corporate doublespeak, he never once made eye contact with me. His gaze was fixed on the middle distance, on his audience, on the performance. I was a prop in his play. When he finished, another round of applause filled the room. He turned to me, the smile still fixed in place, and in a low voice that only I could hear. He said, "We'll talk later. Go get settled in." And then he turned away, immediately absorbed in a conversation with Pierce Latham, dismissing me as easily as he would a waiter. I didn't wait to be dismissed. I walked out of the conference room, my back straight, my head held high, the ghost of his hand still burning on my shoulder. Back at my filing cabinet desk, I sat down and tried to log into my workstation. Access denied. I tried again. Same result. I swiped my temporary badge on the desktop card reader. A new prompt appeared. User profile not found. I took the badge, my tool of access, my proof of belonging, and went to the security office in the basement. The man on duty, a retired cop named Sal, who had known me since I was an intern, looked uncomfortable when he saw me. "Mara, hey, good to see you back," he mumbled, his eyes darting to his monitor. "My credentials aren't working. Sal, can you check my access level?" He typed my name into his system. He winced. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement. "Ah, yeah, looks like your security profile was revised about 6 months ago." "Revised to what?" He swallowed. "Level 0. It's a holding designation. Read-only access to public directories. No network permissions. No access to secure floors. It's the profile we use for employees pending termination review. 6 months ago, that would have been right after I'd emailed my father questioning the strange power of attorney document I'd received. It was a direct retaliation. Hidden in the bureaucratic maze of the company, a preemptive strike. "Who authorized the change?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Sal wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at his screen. "The authorization came from the office of the CEO." Of course it did. I thanked him and walked back towards the elevators, the useless plastic card feeling slick in my hand. On my phone, I pulled up my corporate calendar. It was mostly empty, a blank slate, except for one entry. A mandatory meeting had been added to my schedule for Friday morning. The exact day and time of my emergency court hearing. The subject: Urgent Compliance and Ethics Review. M. Ellison. They weren't just blocking my access. They were building a parallel narrative, creating a paper trail to show I was a problem employee, scheduled for a disciplinary hearing that I would be forced to miss in order to appear in court. It was elegant. It was vicious. Just as I reached my desk, an email popped up from the legal department. The subject line was stark: Directive regarding personal electronic devices. The body of the message was brief and chillingly formal. Effective immediately, and in light of ongoing information security concerns, you are prohibited from bringing any personal laptops, tablets, or storage devices onto Aegis Meridian premises. Your compliance is mandatory. They were cutting me off, isolating me from my own data, my own files, my own history. They were trying to make me a ghost within the machine I had helped build. I sat down at the desk wedged between the past and the future. I looked at the filing cabinets, the useless computer, the email from a legal department that now saw me as a threat, and I did something I hadn't done since I'd read that summons. I smiled. A thin, cold, genuine smile. This wasn't chaos. This was a structured, coordinated attack, and every hostile action they took was another piece of data. The broken scanner, Pierce's greasy ambition, the whispers, the desk, my father's empty words, the downgraded access, the scheduling conflict, the laptop ban. They weren't obstacles. They were coordinates on a map, marking the enemy's positions. They were targets, and I had always been an excellent marksman. I took out a pen and a small, fresh notebook from my bag. At the top of the first page, I wrote a single heading: Phase 1. I sat at the narrow desk between the filing cabinets, the dead screen of the computer a dark mirror reflecting a distorted version of my face. In front of me, my notebook lay open. The heading, Phase 1, was the only thing on the page, the ink stark against the clean white paper. It was a beginning. But to understand the first step of any operation, you have to understand the intelligence that prompted it. You have to go back to the first contact, the moment the threat reveals itself. For me, that wasn't yesterday when the summons arrived. It was 7 months ago, half a world away, in a place that smelled of diesel and frozen mud. The cold at Talvern Forward Operating Base was a living thing. It was a dry, biting cold that worked its way through the layers of your uniform, settled deep in your bones, and stayed there, for a year. That cold was my constant companion. I commanded a small, specialized unit responsible for digital supply chain risk management for the NATO Joint Task Force. My team lived in a world of encrypted data streams, vendor vulnerabilities, and hostile state actors attempting to inject malicious code into everything from drone guidance systems to the software running the generators. Our job was to find the ghosts in the machine before they could materialize. It was meticulous, high-stakes work, a silent war fought on a battlefield of pure information. Every night, after my team was stood down, I would sit in the green, flickering light of my hardened laptop and write my secondary reports. These weren't for the task force commander. They were for Aegis Meridian. They were threat analyses, vulnerability assessments, and strategic recommendations based on the real-world patterns I was observing. They were my way of ensuring the company I had helped build, the company my father ran, stayed ahead of the curve. It was my duty, as I saw it, to feed my battlefield experience back into the corporate mind. Each report was encrypted, sent through a secure channel, and digitally signed in the security line. M.E. It was my mark of ownership, my guarantee of authenticity. For the first 6 months, the routine was unbroken. I sent my reports. I received automated acknowledgments. I had occasional, brief satellite calls with my father, filled with the awkward, stilted conversation of a long-distance relationship strained by security protocols and a 20-year history of him seeing me as a subordinate first and a daughter second. He was always more interested in the marketable intelligence than in my well-being. I had learned to accept it. It was, as he would say, business. The first crack in the foundation appeared on a Tuesday. I tried to log into the Aegis Meridian corporate email server to send my nightly report and was met with a blunt, red-lettered message. Invalid credentials. I tried again, thinking I'd made a typo. The same. I sent a message to our tech support through a secondary channel. The reply was a generic, mass distribution text. As part of our ongoing platform migration to enhance security, all user passwords have been reset. Please follow the link to create new credentials. There had been no prior warning, no memo. A company like Aegis, pathologically obsessed with protocol, did not execute a system-wide password reset without a month of advance notices. It was a breach of their own doctrine. It was sloppy, or it was intentional. I filed the anomaly away in the back of my mind and reset my password. 2 days later, the knife arrived. It wasn't made of steel. It came as a PDF attachment to a sterile, one-line email from my father's executive assistant. The subject line was Urgent IP Authorization Form. The PDF itself was a poorly scanned document, blurry and skewed, as if it had been done in a hurry. It was a power of attorney form. It granted a proxy the right to act on my behalf in all matters related to my employment and intellectual property holdings at Aegis Meridian. It was a ghost key to my professional life. I zoomed in on the signature line. My name, Mara Ellison, was written in a clean, elegant cursive that was nothing like my own sharp, angular script. Below it were the signatures of the proxy and the witness. The proxy, the man now authorized to sign legal documents in my name, was Pierce Latham, the new CFO. The witness, who had officially attested to the authenticity of my forged signature, was my father's personal assistant, a woman who had known me since I was a teenager. The corporate seal of Aegis Meridian was stamped at the bottom, the embossed eagle looking more like a vulture in the blurry scan. I read the fine print, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. The document specifically authorized the proxy to make necessary adjustments to IP ownership and royalty structures for Project Sentinel and all related assets for the purposes of corporate restructuring and shareholder value optimization. They were giving themselves the legal cover to steal my work, and they were using a forgery to do it while I was thousands of miles away, legally bound to a military post and unable to effectively challenge them. My hands were steady as I opened a secure messaging app on my phone. I sent a screenshot of the PDF to my father with a single, clear question. Who authorized this? I watched the screen for a full 10 minutes, the 3 dots of his response appearing and disappearing as he, no doubt, crafted his reply with clinical precision. Finally, the message came through. It was 2 words. The company. Not I did, not an explanation, not a lie. He didn't even try to deny it. He hid behind the corporate entity, using the company as a shield for his own actions. He was telling me that my status as his daughter was irrelevant. In this context, I was just another asset on the balance sheet, and he was the CEO. It was the coldest, most definitive statement he had ever made to me. It was a declaration of war. In the sub-zero chill of the Talvern operations tent, I finally understood. The password reset hadn't been sloppy. It had been a preparatory move, a way to disrupt my normal communication channels just before they sent the document, creating a moment of confusion. This was a coordinated maneuver. I stood up and walked over to the humming, overworked printer in the corner of the tent. I printed the email and the attached PDF. The paper came out warm, a small patch of heat in the oppressive cold. I folded the pages into a neat, tight square, the creases sharp as a blade. I didn't put it in a file. I didn't trust it to a desk. I unbuttoned the chest pocket of my field jacket, the one directly over my heart, and slid the folded paper inside. It sat there, a small, hard square against my ribs, for the next 6 months, a constant, physical reminder of the betrayal. I carried it on patrols, on intelligence briefings, on the long, dark flight home. As my plane descended through the rain into Northcrest yesterday morning, I had taken the papers out. I'd been in a military transport, surrounded by sleeping soldiers, the quiet hum of the engines a steady drone. In the dim cabin light, I unfolded the document. The paper was no longer pristine. It was softened and worn at the creases from being carried for so long, but the ink, the names, the forged signature, were as sharp and damning as the day they were created. The evidence hadn't faded. Now, sitting at this desk of corporate exile, the memory was as vivid as the sterile office air around me. I finally understood the full scope of his strategy. The lawsuit wasn't the first move. It was the last. It was the public execution after the quiet assassination had already taken place. He and Pierce had spent the last year systematically stripping me of my work, my authority, and my reputation, all under the legal protection of a forged document. The accusations of sabotage were their final, brilliant, inverted stroke of cruelty, to accuse me of the very thing they had been doing all along. The true battlefield was never in the mud and snow of Eastern Europe. The enemy wasn't a faceless hacker from a hostile nation. The most dangerous threats are the ones that smile at you. The ones that know your weaknesses. The ones that pat you on the shoulder while their lawyers draft the papers that will destroy you. The knife was never in the hands of a soldier in the opposing trench. It had been waiting for me all along. Here at home, in a gleaming corporate office with ergonomic chairs and an automatic coffee machine that made the perfect latte. Emergency Hearing Room 7B was a small, airless box on the third floor of the courthouse. It had the sterile, impersonal feel of a place designed for quick, unpleasant procedures, like a field hospital for legal disputes. The air was thick with the smell of old paper, cheap wood polish, and the faint, anxious scent of human sweat. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, incessant buzz that vibrated at the edge of hearing. At the front of the room, on a raised dais, sat Judge Mallory. She was a woman in her late 50s with a face that seemed permanently etched with the fatigue of having read too many convoluted financial reports. Her eyes, magnified slightly by her reading glasses, scanned the documents before her with a practiced, weary efficiency. She looked less like a dispenser of justice and more like a forensic accountant searching for a rounding error. I sat at the defendant's table with Captain Eva Rostova, the JAG lawyer I had met that morning. She was sharp, professional, and an expert in military employment law. But this corporate ambush was outside her usual purview. She was here as an advisor, a steadying presence, across the narrow aisle. My father sat at the plaintiff's table. He wasn't looking at me. He was flanked by a team of 3 lawyers from the city's most expensive corporate firm. Their suits were immaculate, their leather briefcases gleaming under the flat light. They looked like a pack of well-dressed wolves, and their lead counsel, a man named Marcus Thorne, was clearly the alpha. He exuded an aura of aggressive, expensive confidence. "We are here today, Your Honor," Thorne began, his voice smooth and resonant, "on a matter of extreme urgency and significant public interest." The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenotype machine, the soft, rhythmic clicking the only other sound in the room. Aegis Meridian Systems is a key partner in our nation's defense infrastructure. We develop and protect the most sensitive data imaginable. The integrity of that data is paramount. Unfortunately, we have discovered a grave internal breach, perpetrated by the defendant, Ms. Mara Ellison. He let the name hang in the air. A formal indictment. I didn't flinch. I kept my gaze fixed on Judge Mallory. "Ms. Ellison," Thorne continued, pacing slowly, "recently returned from a military deployment. We welcomed her home, regrettably. It appears her return was marked not by a commitment to the company's mission, but by a coordinated effort to illegally access and exfiltrate proprietary source code and sensitive contract information." He gestured to his associate, who dimmed the lights and turned on a large monitor. "We have internal security footage, Your Honor." The screen flickered to life, showing a series of grainy, time-stamped video clips. They were a masterclass in deceptive editing. There I was, on my first day back. Sitting at the temporary desk, the video was shot from a high angle, making my actions look furtive. It showed me plugging a USB drive into the workstation, the drive containing my backed-up employee handbook. The clip was cut just before the access denied message would have appeared on screen. Another clip showed me at the security office in the basement, talking to Sal. The audio was muted, but the editing made it look like a clandestine exchange. The final clip was the most damning. It was older, from before my deployment, showing me at my real workstation, transferring a large file directory to an external drive. They presented it as if it had happened yesterday. What they didn't show was the context. I had been making an authorized backup of the Sentinel project files ahead of a planned server migration, an action documented in a dozen emails they had conveniently omitted. "As you can see," Thorne said, his voice dripping with faux gravity, "this is a clear pattern of unauthorized data removal. We cannot know the extent of the damage or what she intends to do with this information. Therefore, we are asking for an immediate temporary restraining order, completely barring Ms. Ellison from all Aegis Meridian premises and systems, pending a full forensic investigation." Judge Mallory peered over her glasses at the screen, then at me. Her expression was unreadable. "Ms. Ellison," she said, her voice dry as parchment. "Your response?" I stood up. My hands were steady. My voice, when I spoke, was calm and measured. "Your Honor, my name is Mara Ellison. What counsel for the plaintiff has just presented is a work of fiction, created through deliberately misleading and decontextualized video clips." Thorne started to object, but the judge silenced him with a flick of her wrist. "Go on, Ms. Ellison." "The plaintiff's entire case," I said, walking to the witness stand where I had placed a single file folder, "is built on the premise that I am a disgruntled employee who suddenly turned against her company upon returning from active duty. The truth is, the company turned against me long before I came home." I opened the folder and took out a single, folded sheaf of papers. I approached the clerk and handed it to her. "I would like to submit this document into evidence. It is a power of attorney form, provided to me by Aegis Meridian 7 months ago, while I was stationed at a NATO forward operating base in the Baltic region." The clerk handed the document to Judge Mallory. I saw her eyes narrow as she took in the worn, creased paper, the blurry scan quality I had described. "This document," I continued, my voice ringing with clarity in the small room, "purports to bear my signature, authorizing a proxy to take control of my intellectual property at the company. I did not sign this document, Your Honor. It is a forgery." A murmur went through the small public gallery. Thorne was on his feet. "Objection. This is irrelevant to the matter of the data breach." "It is entirely relevant," I countered, turning to face him. "It establishes a pattern of illicit activity on the part of the plaintiff, intended to illegally seize my work while I was unable to defend myself." "Your Honor," I said, turning back to the judge, "to be clear about my whereabouts when this document was supposedly signed in Northcrest." I retrieved a second document from my folder. It was crisp, official, printed on government letterhead. "These are my certified deployment orders from the Department of the Army, confirming my continuous active duty service out of the country for the entirety of last year." I handed the orders to the clerk, who passed them to the judge. The room was silent now, except for the hum of the lights. Judge Mallory placed the two documents side by side, the forged authorization and the official military orders, a lie and a truth. She looked from the papers to me, then to my father's table. For the first time, a flicker of something other than boredom crossed her face. It was irritation. She peered down at the power of attorney form. "Ms. Ellison," she asked, her voice sharp, "if you didn't sign this, who did? Your name is right here." I paused, letting the weight of the question settle. I looked at my father, but he was staring intently at the grain of the wooden table in front of him. "Someone on the company's payroll, Your Honor," I replied. The implication was clear, and it landed with the force of a physical blow. I hadn't accused a specific person. I had accused his entire organization. Thorne began to bluster, but the judge cut him off. "Enough." She took off her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. She was a woman who dealt in facts and figures, and the facts in front of her didn't add up. "Mr. Thorne, Your client is a defense contractor alleging a significant security breach. I cannot ignore that. However, Ms. Ellison has presented evidence that raises serious questions about the plaintiff's conduct and credibility. She put her glasses back on. I am going to grant a partial restraining order, but on a very limited basis. Ms. Ellison will be barred from company premises for a period of 72 hours. This will give Aegis Meridian time to secure their systems, and Ms. Ellison time to secure proper counsel for what is clearly a more complex matter than a simple data theft case. 72 hours. It was a window. Enough time for them to try and bury their tracks. Enough time for me to find them. Before you finalize that order, Your Honor, I said quickly, I have one request. To prove that the allegations of unauthorized access are false, I need to be able to show where I was and what I was doing. I request continued, but strictly limited, read-only access to a single part of the network, the system security and access logs for the Sentinel Project servers, no write privileges, no ability to change or delete anything, simply the ability to view the audit trail. The truth is in that data. Thorne objected immediately, calling it a security risk, but the judge, a creature of data herself, saw the logic in my request. The request is reasonable, she ruled. The order will include a provision for read-only log access for the defendant. Anything else? Thorne, looking furious, shook his head. Very well, the judge banged her gavel, a sharp crack that made me flinch. This hearing is adjourned. As people began to gather their papers, I walked over to my father's table. His lawyers moved to form a protective wall, but I ignored them. I stopped in front of him. He was still looking down, refusing to meet my gaze. Dad, I said, my voice low and quiet. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, he turned his head and looked away from me, toward the wall, presenting me with his profile. It was a deliberate, final act of cowardice. He had rendered his judgment. He had nothing more to say. I turned and walked away without another word. I left the stuffy courtroom, past Captain Rostova, who gave me a nod of grim respect, and out into the grand, echoing marble hallway of the courthouse. I didn't stop. I pushed through the heavy doors and walked out onto the wide stone steps, into the gray, drizzling afternoon. The cool, damp air felt clean after the recycled atmosphere of the courtroom. I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number. It was answered on the first ring. I didn't say hello. I didn't offer any preamble. I simply gave the command we had agreed upon. Phase 1. The moment the courthouse doors closed behind me, my 72-hour clock started. It wasn't a countdown to my defeat. It was the duration of my counteroffensive, back in the sterile quiet of my apartment. I didn't rest. I established my command center at the small kitchen table. My personal laptop, now my primary weapon, was flanked by a legal pad, 3 different colored pens, and a constantly refilled mug of black coffee. The court order had been specific. Read-only access, a digital key that allowed me to look but not touch. For my purposes, that was more than enough. You don't need to move the furniture to map the layout of a room. I logged in. The Aegis Meridian system greeted me with a neutered version of my old administrative dashboard. Most functions were grayed out, inactive, but the one I needed was live. The portal to the raw server logs. It was like looking at the unrendered code of the universe. Millions of lines of text, each one a digital footprint, a timestamp, a user ID, an IP address, a device, MAC address, an action performed. It was an ocean of data, and somewhere in it was the predator I was hunting. My first command was a targeted data extraction. I initiated the download of all security and access logs for the Sentinel Project servers and source code repositories for the last 90 days. The progress bar moved with agonizing slowness as gigabytes of data streamed from their fortified servers to my small apartment. While it downloaded, I worked the phones. My first call was to Aegis Meridian's internal security desk, a call I was legally entitled to make. I informed the on-duty manager that, Per the judge's order, I required a verified list of all authorized workstation hardware, including device IDs and MAC addresses, assigned to the 17th floor. He grumbled, but the court order was ironclad. An hour later, an encrypted file arrived in my email. The baseline. With the logs downloaded and the hardware list secured, the hunt began. I wrote a simple script to perform the primary task. Cross-reference every single device MAC address that had accessed the Sentinel repository in the last 90 days against the company's official list of authorized hardware. The script ran, lines of code scrolling past on my screen as the program sifted through millions of entries. I drank my coffee and watched, my posture as rigid as if I were on watch. After 20 minutes, the script finished and kicked out a result file. It was a list of anomalies. Most were benign: a new laptop for an executive, a temporary device for a contractor. But one stood out. One MAC address appeared repeatedly, logging in at odd hours, always between 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock a.m., and the credentials it used belonged to a senior engineer named Frank Madigan. I knew Frank. He was a brilliant coder who had retired 7 months ago, a fact I quickly confirmed with a public search of his social media, which was full of pictures of him holding a large fish in Florida. Yet, his credentials were being used to access the most sensitive parts of my project. The device fingerprint, the ghost terminal's MAC address, did not exist on the company's official hardware manifest. It was a ghost, operated by a ghost. I filtered the logs, isolating every action taken by Frank Madigan's ghost credentials. The user wasn't just looking, they were copying. Large data packets were being transferred from the Sentinel repository to a sandboxed, temporary directory, a staging area. From there, they were likely being offloaded onto an external device. This was the activity their doctored video had accused me of. They had framed me using a recording of their own crime. The next step was to connect the digital ghost to a physical presence. The timestamps were my guide. The access was always in that pre-dawn hour, a time when the floor would be deserted except for the cleaning crew. But how was the user getting to the 17th floor without creating a record? I pulled another set of logs I was entitled to view. Building operations, specifically the maintenance records for the service elevators. I cross-referenced the timestamps, a perfect correlation. Every single time the ghost terminal was active. A service elevator had been logged as making an unscheduled stop on the 17th floor, precisely within the access window. It was a logistical blind spot. The regular elevators were monitored, but the service elevator, used by maintenance and cleaning crews during a shift change, was a back door. While my computer continued to process data, I opened a new front. Phase 1 wasn't just about data. It was about applying overwhelming, multi-vector pressure. I spent an hour on the phone with a very helpful, very meticulous clerk at the Northcrest City Compliance Office. I calmly explained that I was a recently returned service member employed by a city defense contractor, and that I had reason to believe my employer was in violation of the Federal Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act. I filed a formal inquiry, not a lawsuit. The inquiry would trigger an automatic, official request from the city to Aegis for all records pertaining to my employment status, my deployment, and the company's policies regarding service members. It was a bureaucratic hand grenade with a 48-hour fuse. Next, I used their own contract against them. Aegis Meridian's lucrative partnership with the city came with a transparency clause, a provision I had insisted on during the last negotiation. It allowed for targeted freedom of information requests related to subcontracting and third-party expenditures. I drafted and sent a formal request via a legal courier to Aegis's general counsel. My request was narrow and specific. I demanded copies of all invoices for external consultancy services related to intellectual property and strategic risk, processed in the last 6 months. It was a shot in the dark, but a calculated one. A crime of this magnitude, a corporate conspiracy, almost always involves outside help and off-the-books payments. For 24 hours, the only response was silence. Then, late in the afternoon of the second day, I received a thick PDF file from the Aegis legal department in response to my FOI request. It was their document dump, full of redacted contracts and boilerplate service agreements. I spent hours sifting through it, my eyes burning from the screen. And then I found it. A single invoice for $50,000 from a company I had never heard of. Prater LLC. The service rendered was listed as Proprietary Risk Mitigation Analysis. The invoice was dated exactly 1 day after the forged power of attorney was created, and the same day my security credentials had been secretly downgraded to level 0. My heart beat a little faster. This was it. I ran a quick business search on Prater LLC. The company was registered less than a year ago. It had no website, no public presence. Its official corporate address was a PIO box in a mail depot on Ashmere Street, 2 towns over, and the name of the registered agent, the individual legally responsible for the shell company, was Robert Latham. A quick, cross-referenced social media search confirmed it in under 5 minutes. Robert Latham was Pierce Latham's brother-in-law. It was the missing piece, the motive. Pierce hadn't just been an ambitious executive. He was siphoning company money into his own family's pockets as payment for his role in hijacking my project. I now had the complete chain of evidence: a ghost terminal performing illicit actions, a physical pattern of access via the service elevator, a financial instrument for a kickback in the form of a shell company, and a prime suspect whose family was on the receiving end. I couldn't use the Prater LLC connection in court yet. The link was strong but circumstantial, but the ghost terminal was irrefutable, hard data. I spent the next 2 hours compiling a concise, clear report: the raw access logs showing the unauthorized device, the official Aegis hardware roster proving it was a ghost, and a sworn affidavit from me, detailing the findings and the timeline. I encrypted the file and emailed it to the court clerk, officially submitting it as a supplementary exhibit in my case. The evidence was now on the record, time-stamped, and legally protected. They couldn't make it disappear. The clock on my wall showed I had 8 hours left out of my 72. They thought they had given me a deadline. They thought they had put me in a cage. But they had made a classic tactical error. They had mistaken a fortified position for a prison. They had given me time to think, time to plan, and most foolishly of all, they had given me the data. The 72-hour injunction was no longer their anchor to hold me down. It was my lever, and I was about to move their world. Data is clean. It provides a skeleton, a map of the enemy's movements. But data can't testify. It can't show fear or regret. It can't be cross-examined. Firewalls can be breached, and logs can be argued over by expensive lawyers. A conspiracy isn't just a string of code. It's a series of whispers, compromises, and quiet acts of cowardice. Phase 1 was about finding the skeleton. Phase 2 was about giving it a human face. My first target was the weakest link in their human chain. My analysis of the ghost terminal's activity showed it was maintained not by a senior engineer, but by someone with lower-level admin privileges, someone performing routine checks, a digital janitor. I cross-referenced the maintenance logs with the IT department's intern roster. I found a name: Harlow Vance, a final-year cybersecurity student from Northcrest University, young, ambitious, and utterly expendable to men like Pierce and my father. I didn't contact her through official channels. I found her student profile online and sent a simple, unthreatening text from a burner number. Harlow, this is Mara Ellison. I know you're in a difficult position. I'm not looking for a scapegoat. I'm looking for the truth. Let me buy you lunch. Off-site. Just a conversation. We met at a small, steamy soup and sandwich shop 5 blocks from the Aegis Tower. A place so aggressively non-corporate it felt like a different country. Harlow was huddled in a booth in the back, her hands wrapped around a glass of water. She was swimming in her university sweatshirt, her face pale, her eyes darting toward the door every time the bell chimed. Her hands were trembling, a slight, continuous tremor that made the water in her glass shimmer. "Thank you for meeting me," I began, keeping my voice low and calm. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, her words barely audible over the clatter of the kitchen. "They said not to talk to anyone, especially not to you." "They?" "Mr. Latham." His office sent a memo to the IT interns, a non-disclosure reminder. It was pointed. I nodded. Harlow, I'm not here to get you in trouble. I already have the logs. I have the MAC address of the ghost terminal on the 17th floor. I know it was you on the keyboard. The color drained from her face. She looked like a cornered animal. It wasn't, I was just doing what I was told. Mr. Latham said it was a quarantine diagnostic machine for a special project. He said Mr. Madigan was consulting remotely and needed a terminal that wasn't on the main network. My job was just to make sure it was online and connected. I never downloaded anything. Her voice was thin, reedy with fear. She was telling the truth. She was the tool, not the hand that wielded it. Did he ever ask you to do anything else? Verify a login, maybe? She hesitated, chewing on her lower lip. A few times, he'd call me to his office. A message would pop up on the terminal's screen, a two-factor authentication request. A code would be sent to a phone number, and I'd have to read the code on the screen back to him over the desk phone. And whose phone number was the code sent to? I don't know, she said, her eyes welling up. It was his phone. He would get the text, read me the 6-digit number, and I'd type it in. That's all. I swear. I leaned forward slightly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I spoke to her not as a suspect, but as a colleague. Harlow, look at me. You're a cybersecurity student. You know what a ghost terminal using a retired employee's credentials looks like. You know what backdooring a two-factor authentication system is. They used your hands to do it, but you're smart enough to know what you were facilitating. I paused. When this comes out, and it will, they are going to say you were the rogue agent, the ambitious intern who went too far. Your career will be over before it starts. They will sacrifice you to save themselves. You know I'm right. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She nodded. A tiny, jerky movement. You have a choice right now, I said softly. It's not about them. It's about you. How do you want to be remembered in the incident report that will define your future? As the person who followed an illegal order, or as the one who helped correct it? She was quiet for a long time, staring into her water glass. The trembling in her hands subsided, replaced by a kind of resolve. What do you need? She finally asked, her voice stronger. The next time you're asked to authenticate that terminal, I said, take a picture of the screen with your phone, a clear shot of the two-factor authentication page, showing the prompt and the last 4 digits of the phone number it's sending the code to. That's all. She met my eyes. Okay, she said. I'll do it. My next meeting was with a man named Reuben, the senior night guard for the 17th floor. I met him at the end of his shift at a 24-hour diner. He was a large man in his 60s with tired, kind eyes, and a memory for detail that came from 30 years of watching people come and go when they thought no one was looking. I don't look at the logs, ma'am, he said, stirring his coffee. I look at the people, and yeah, I remember them. 2 guys, always came up in the service elevator, maybe 2, 3 in the morning, every Wednesday, like clockwork. Do you know who they were? He shrugged. Never saw their faces clear. One was tall, wore a suit like he was sleeping in it. The other was smaller, always carried a briefcase, but I remember one thing. He took a sip of his coffee. The little guy, the one with the briefcase, he always brought a coffee with him. Same one every time. I could smell it when they got off the elevator. That sweet, cheap vanilla stuff from the machine in the lobby. You can't miss it. The assistant to my father, the one who witnessed the forged signature, was a small man who was famous for his addiction to the vanilla latte from the lobby vending machine. Reuben, I asked, would you be willing to give a sworn statement about what you saw? They're trying to railroad you, aren't they? He said, looking at me directly. I saw your dad build that place. I saw you come in as a kid. What they're doing isn't right. He pushed his cup aside. You write it up. I'll sign it. And Sal down in security owes me a favor. I'll ask him for the service elevator camera stills for those nights. The quality is terrible, but it's something. My third meeting took me to the suburbs, to a quiet house with a well-tended garden. It was the home of Arthur Vance, Aegis Meridian's former general counsel. Arthur had been with the company for 20 years. He was a man of quiet integrity, a corporate lawyer who actually believed in the law. He had been unceremoniously encouraged to take early retirement 3 months into my deployment. He welcomed me into his study, a room lined with books on law and history. "Mara," he said, his face etched with a sad sort of resignation. "I was wondering when you'd call. I read about the hearing in the business section. A disgrace. Arthur, I need to know why you were pushed out." He sighed, settling into his leather chair. "Because I was a roadblock, my dear. Your father and his new friend, Latham, were restructuring. They called it streamlining. I called it stripping the company for parts. They came to me with a new policy proposal regarding intellectual property generated by employees on extended leave, specifically military deployment." He pointed to a filing cabinet. "I told them it was legally and ethically indefensible. It was designed to expropriate the work of service members, and it likely violated a dozen federal statutes." "So you blocked it," I said. "I tried, I delayed, I buried it in committee, and for my troubles, I was offered a generous retirement package I couldn't refuse. They found a more pliable lawyer to take my place." He stood up and walked to the filing cabinet. "I never throw away my notes." He came back with a thin file. Inside was a document draft. The title was Aegis Meridian Policy Addendum 11B, Protection of Intellectual Property and Employment Status for Active Duty Service Members. It was a policy I had proposed before I left, and he had championed. It contained ironclad protections for returning soldiers. Stapled to the back of the draft was a series of handwritten notes, his own legal analysis, and at the bottom of the last page, a single, angry annotation. "Conrad killed it, said it was an unnecessary liability." He handed me the file. "This is my copy," he said. "It's a record of their intent. They weren't just opportunistic. Mara, this was premeditated." My final conversation of the day was with Councilman Miller, the head of the city's oversight committee for municipal contracts. Aegis Meridian's primary security contract with the city of Northcrest was up for renewal next week. It was the foundation of the company's public image and a significant chunk of its revenue. I didn't give him all the details. I simply laid out the timeline of my deployment, the forged document, and the lawsuit filed against me upon my return. I spoke not as an angry victim, but as a concerned citizen and a military officer. I told him that the company tasked with the city's cybersecurity was currently being run by executives who engaged in forgery and fraud against a deployed soldier. He listened patiently, his face grim. When I was finished, he looked out his office window at the City Hall Plaza. "My son just finished his first year at Annapolis," he said quietly. He turned back to me. "Aegis is a valued partner, but the city of Northcrest values its service members more. This contract has a morals clause for a reason." He stood up, signaling the end of our meeting. "We have a public review session before the vote. It's usually a formality." He paused, his eyes holding mine. "But truth is a better firewall than anything Aegis has ever sold us." I walked out of his office with that phrase echoing in my head. He was right. My father and Pierce had built their case on firewalls of corporate legalese, doctored videos, and intimidation. I was building mine out of people, a nervous intern, an observant night guard, a principled lawyer, and a politician with a conscience. My 72-hour clock was almost up, but their time was running out faster. The boardroom on the 20th floor was my father's sanctuary. It was a space designed to project power and control, a long, sterile room walled in frosted glass that blurred the city skyline into an abstract watercolor of gray and steel. A single, monolithic table of polished black granite ran its length, flanked by 24 identical black leather chairs. It was a corporate mausoleum, and at its head, my father sat. He wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He sat with perfect, rigid posture, a bronze statue of a CEO, his hands resting on either side of a closed leather portfolio. The other board members, a collection of grim-faced men and one woman in expensive, conservative suits, were arranged down the table, their silence a tangible force in the room. They were waiting. For me. The door opened with a soft hydraulic hiss. I walked in. I wasn't wearing a uniform or a business suit. I was dressed in simple, severe black slacks and a gray blouse. I was a neutral element in their black and white world. My lawyer, a sharp corporate litigator I'd hired the day before, followed a step behind me, carrying a single, slim briefcase. "Thank you for seeing us," my lawyer said, his voice respectful but firm. "As per Judge Mallory's order, my client is exercising her right to address the board for a period of 10 minutes regarding the pending litigation." My father didn't acknowledge me. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to Pierce Latham, who sat at his right hand. Pierce smiled. It was a wide, predatory smile, the kind that showed too many teeth. He radiated a smug, victorious confidence. The 72-hour injunction was over, and as far as he was concerned, I was a cornered animal about to be put down. "Of course," Pierce said, his voice oozing magnanimity. "We believe in full transparency." He stood and picked up a remote. The frosted glass wall behind my father flickered to life, becoming a massive presentation screen. The first slide appeared. It was the Aegis Meridian logo, followed by a title in bold, aggressive font, "Mitigating Personnel-Related Security Risks." He was opening with an attack, framing the entire meeting around me as a threat. It was exactly what I had expected. "As we're all aware," Pierce began, "the human element is often the weakest link in any security chain." I didn't let him finish. I walked calmly to the head of the table, to the integrated AV port set into the granite. I opened my hand. In my palm was a single, standard-issue company USB drive, unremarkable in every way except for the small, court evidence tag affixed to its base. "Excuse me, Pierce," I said, my voice cutting through his polished monologue. "The court order grants me 10 minutes to present my own information. I'd like to use the company's system to do so, for the sake of clarity and to ensure a verifiable chain of custody." Pierce's smile tightened. He couldn't object without looking like he was trying to hide something. "By all means," he said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. I plugged the drive in. His title slide vanished, replaced not by a presentation of my own, but by a direct, live, read-only feed from the Aegis Meridian server logs. It was a cascade of raw, unfiltered data, millions of lines of black text scrolling against a white background. The board members leaned forward, confused. "This," I said, my voice as calm and steady as a ship's chronometer, "is the audit trail for the Sentinel project. The court granted me permission to view it. For the last 90 days, as you can see, there have been regular, unauthorized intrusions into the source code repository, the very repository I am accused of raiding." I used a laser pointer to highlight a repeating pattern in the data stream. These intrusions were not conducted by me. They were conducted by a ghost terminal, an unregistered piece of hardware physically located on the 17th floor, using the credentials of a retired employee. But the most interesting part is where the copied data was sent. I highlighted another string of text, a server address. It was routed to a sandboxed external server registered to a consulting LLC, a company named Prater. I clicked a button on the small remote I held. The screen changed. The log data was replaced by a grainy, black and white still image. It was from the service elevator's security camera. The timestamp in the corner corresponded to one of the breaches. The image showed two figures. Their faces were obscured by the poor resolution and angle, but their silhouettes were distinct. One was tall and thin, the other shorter, clutching a briefcase. These intrusions, as Reuben, the night guard for the 17th floor, has attested in a sworn affidavit, always occurred between 2 and 3 a.m. They were always perpetrated by two individuals who arrived via the service elevator, bypassing the main security checkpoints. I clicked again. The screen now showed a high-resolution photo of a smartphone screen. It was the picture Harlow had sent me. It was a close-up of the two-factor authentication prompt on the ghost terminal. To access the system, the intruders needed to bypass a two-factor authentication protocol. I explained. This protocol sent a one-time passcode to a registered cell phone. The system, as you can see, displays the last 4 digits of that phone number for verification. The numbers were clearly visible on the screen. 9844. I turned my gaze from the screen and let it settle on Pierce Latham. "Pierce," I said, my voice devoid of emotion, "would you mind telling the board the last 4 digits of your company-issued cell phone?" Every head in the room swiveled to face him. His smug smile had evaporated. His face, usually so tan, was now a pale, mottled gray. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. A thin sheen of sweat had appeared on his forehead. "There's no need," I said, clicking the remote again. The next image on the screen was a side-by-side comparison. The photo from Harlow, next to the official company contact roster for senior executives. Pierce Latham's name was highlighted. Next to it, his phone number, ending in 9844. A sharp intake of breath came from someone down the table. The process, as attested to by IT intern Harlow Vance, was simple. I continued, my voice relentless. The taller man would initiate the login. The shorter man, my father's assistant, would call Ms. Vance to the terminal to read the prompt. He would then call Pierce Latham, who would provide the 6-digit code from his personal phone, granting them access to steal my intellectual property. The night guard, Reuben, remembers my father's assistant well. He always brought a vanilla latte with him on these late-night excursions. The silence in the room was now absolute. It was heavy, suffocating. My father hadn't moved. He was staring at the screen, at the damning evidence, his face a mask of stone. He looked like a man watching his own kingdom burn. "But why go to all this trouble?" I asked the silent room. "Why create such an elaborate scheme?" I clicked the remote one last time. The final image filled the screen. It was the $50,000 invoice from Prater LLC. Next to it, I had placed the internal wire transfer authorization that paid it. The camera zoomed in on the signature line at the bottom of the authorization form. It was a strong, confident signature, one I had seen on my report cards and my birthday checks my entire life. Conrad Ellison. "This," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, "is the payment, $50,000 of company money, funneled to a shell corporation owned by Pierce Latham's brother-in-law, authorized for payment for consulting services the day after my security credentials were illegally revoked." I let the image hang there, the signature a testament to the depth of the betrayal. This was never about security. It was about theft, a conspiracy to steal my work, sell it back to the company through a proxy, and frame me for the crime. I lowered the laser pointer. My 10 minutes were up. No one spoke. The board members stared at the screen, their faces a mixture of shock and cold fury. They weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at my father. He, in turn, was looking at Pierce, a gaze so cold it could have frozen mercury. Pierce Latham was no longer looking at anyone. He was staring at the polished surface of the table as if it were a vast, empty abyss he was about to fall into. The trap had been sprung. The silence stretched, broken only by a faint, high-pitched buzz from one of the recessed lights in the ceiling. It sounded, in the dead quiet of the room, like a single, clear note marking the end of an era. It sounded like the snapping of a lock. We were back in hearing room 7B. 72 hours had passed, the same humming fluorescent lights, the same tired wood paneling, but the atmosphere had undergone a fundamental chemical change. The air, which before had been thick with my father's confidence, was now charged with a nervous, volatile energy. Marcus Thorne, his lead counsel, no longer looked like a predator. He looked like a man who had been awake for 3 days, fueled by nothing but bad news and stale coffee. His tie was slightly askew. A single bead of sweat traced a path from his temple down his jawline. He knew they were walking into a minefield. He just didn't know where the mines were buried. Judge Mallory was on the bench, her expression as impassive as ever, but her eyes were sharp, focused. She looked from me to my father's legal team and back again. "We are here to review the temporary restraining order, Mr. Thorne," I assume the plaintiff wishes to make the order permanent? Before Thorne could launch into whatever pre-written speech he had prepared, my lawyer stood. "Your Honor," she said, her voice a calm island in the tense sea. "Before we proceed, the defendant has a motion. We have new evidence. Evidence that is not only pertinent but is, in fact, unfolding in real time. We request the court's permission to present it via a secure live video feed." Thorne shot to his feet. "Objection! This is a procedural ambush. We have no idea what this alleged evidence is. Introducing an unknown live feed into these proceedings is irregular and prejudicial." His voice was a half-beat too loud, a tremor of panic vibrating beneath the bluster. "Counselor," Judge Mallory said, her gaze fixing on my lawyer, "what is the nature of this feed?" "It is a live feed from the 20th floor boardroom of Aegis Meridian Systems," my lawyer replied evenly, "where, at this very moment, my client has just concluded a 10-minute presentation to the board of directors, as was her right under the previous court order, a presentation outlining the conspiracy that is the true basis of this lawsuit." The judge's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. Thorne was sputtering now. "This is a private, internal corporate matter. It has no place being broadcast in a public courtroom." "On the contrary, Mr. Thorne," Judge Mallory countered, her voice taking on an edge of steel. "Your client, Aegis Meridian, is a primary defense contractor for this city and for the federal government. The conduct of its leadership is a matter of significant public interest. If there is evidence of fraud and malfeasance occurring within that boardroom, it is absolutely the business of this court." She looked at the court officer. "Set up the feed." Thorne sank into his chair, his face ashen. A technician wheeled in a large monitor, the same one they had used to show their fabricated video of me, and connected a laptop. After a moment of static, a silent, high-definition image filled the screen. It was a live view of the boardroom I had just left. The tableau was frozen, a portrait of corporate shock. The board members were staring. Stone-faced, Pierce Latham looked like a ghost, his skin pale and slick with sweat. And at the head of the table, my father sat, rigid, staring at the blank screen where my evidence had just been displayed. The live feed was a silent testament to the bomb I had just detonated. My lawyer sat down. I stood up. "Your Honor," I began, my voice clear and carrying in the quiet room. "What you are seeing is the Aegis Meridian Board of Directors processing the evidence of a year-long conspiracy to defraud the company and frame a returning service member." I picked up a document from my table. It was the draft policy from Arthur Vance. As a U.S. Army Reserve officer, I am protected under federal law from professional retaliation related to my service. Aegis Meridian's own internal policies, before they were buried by the current leadership, affirmed these protections. I quote from a draft policy a former general counsel was forced out for defending. "No employee shall have their employment status, compensation, or ownership of intellectual property adversely affected or expropriated as a direct or indirect result of their fulfillment of military duties." I placed the paper down. My service was not honored. It was used. It was seen as an opportunity. I walked the judge through the evidence, my voice a steady, dispassionate metronome of facts. The live, silent feed of the stunned boardroom served as my backdrop. The chain of evidence is unbroken. It begins with a forged legal document, created while I was on deployment. It continues with the secret, unauthorized downgrading of my security credentials. It is executed via a ghost terminal, using a retired employee's login, physically accessed by my father's own assistant, and authenticated by the company's CFO, Pierce Latham. The goal was to steal the source code for Project Sentinel, a project I created, and the motive was profit, funneled through a shell corporation owned by Mr. Latham's family, paid for with a wire transfer signed and authorized by the CEO, Conrad Ellison. I stopped. I let the weight of the accusation fill the space. The camera feed from the boardroom remained still, a silent, damning confirmation. Judge Mallory stared at the monitor, then down at the documents I had submitted. She took off her glasses, When she spoke, her voice was cold with a contained, judicial fury. This court is not a tool to be used in a corporate conspiracy. The plaintiff's request for a permanent restraining order is denied. The temporary order is hereby vacated, effective immediately. She wasn't finished. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented, this court orders the immediate administrative suspension of Mr. Pierce Latham from all duties at Aegis Meridian, pending a full internal and likely federal investigation. All of his electronic devices and access credentials are to be surrendered. This court also orders Aegis Meridian to conduct a full, transparent internal investigation into this matter, overseen by a court-appointed third party. It was a complete reversal, a total victory. But before the judge could bang her gavel, a voice cut through the room. "Your Honor, may I speak?" It was my father. He was on his feet. Thorne put a hand on his arm, trying to restrain him, but he shook it off. He stood tall, but something was broken in his posture. He looked at the judge, but I knew he was speaking to me. He used a voice I hadn't heard in years, a low, resonant tone that he had used to teach me how to tie a proper Windsor knot, how to read a compass, how to be strong. It was a voice from a different lifetime, and hearing it now felt like a violation. "Everything I did," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "Every decision I made was for the good of this company. Aegis Meridian is more than a business. It is a critical asset. It protects this city. It protects this country. Sometimes, protecting the whole requires making difficult sacrifices. It isn't personal. It's about ensuring the survival and strength of the institution." He spoke of the company, of the institution, of assets and sacrifices. He spoke of business. The words he never said were the ones that screamed the loudest in the silent courtroom. He never said, "I'm sorry." He never said, "For my daughter." I felt the court's public access camera turn toward me. The small red light, a burning eye. Everyone was waiting for my response, for an outburst, for tears. I gave them something else. I looked directly into the lens, speaking not just to the judge, not just to my father, but to the city, to the shareholders, to every employee who had ever been told that integrity was the company's first priority. "Integrity is not a slogan you carve into a marble wall," I said, my voice cold and clear. "It is an audit trail, with a name on it." Judge Mallory's face was set like stone. She lifted the gavel. The sharp, definitive crack echoed in the silent room. It wasn't the sound of an ending. It was the sound of a heavy door being kicked open. The judge's gavel was a gunshot marking the end of one battle and the beginning of another. The live feed from the courtroom went dead, plunging the boardroom on the 20th floor back into its own suffocating silence. The image of Judge Mallory's resolute face vanished, but her verdict hung in the air like cordite. For a long moment, no one moved. The board members, my father, Pierce Latham, they were all frozen, trapped in the amber of the immediate aftermath. Then, a single, deliberate movement broke the spell. A woman at the far end of the table, an older, stern-faced board member named Eleanor Vance, who had been on the board longer than I'd been alive, reached out and methodically closed her leather portfolio. The soft click was as loud as a door slamming shut. "Well," she said, her voice dry as dust. That was illuminating. She looked not at my father, but at the corporate council. Under Section 4B of the corporate bylaws, any 3 board members may call an emergency session to vote on the temporary suspension of an executive officer pending an investigation that may cause material harm to the company. I am calling that session now. Another board member, a man who ran a logistics empire, immediately seconded the motion. A third followed. It was a cascade. My father's authority had not just been challenged, it had evaporated. Pierce Latham began to push his chair back, a frantic, animal instinct to flee. "This is an internal matter," he started to say, his voice thin and reedy. "Sit down, Mr. Latham," Eleanor commanded, her voice cutting him off like a razor. "You are very much an internal matter we are about to discuss." Pierce froze, half standing, before sinking back into his chair. He looked at my father for help, for a sign, but my father's gaze was 1,000 yards away, still locked on the blank screen where his legacy had been dismantled. "The motion has been made and seconded," Eleanor continued, taking charge with the ease of someone who had weathered a dozen corporate storms. "We will now hold a vote on the temporary removal of Conrad Ellison from the position of Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. The floor is open for nominations for an interim replacement." A tense, awkward silence followed. The board members looked at each other. Then, reluctantly, at me. They saw me not as a candidate, but as the catalyst, the destructive force that had brought them to this precipice. They were waiting for me to make my move, to claim my prize. I didn't. I remained standing, my hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. "I am not a candidate," I said, my voice clear and even, dispelling the tension. "This company doesn't need a revolution. It needs a restoration. It needs a leader who understands its core mission, who has the respect of its employees, and who was sidelined by the very corruption we have just witnessed." I turned my head slightly and looked down the table. "I nominate Vera Kincaid." The name landed with quiet force. Vera Kincaid, the Chief Operating Officer, a brilliant, no-nonsense logistician who had been with Aegis for 25 years. She was universally respected, deeply knowledgeable, and had been systematically excluded from my father's inner circle since Pierce Latham's arrival. She was the steady hand he had cast aside for a sycophant. Vera, who had been silent throughout the entire presentation, looked up, her expression one of surprise, then a dawning, steely resolve. "I second the nomination," Eleanor Vance said without a moment's hesitation. My father finally stirred. He turned his head slowly and looked at me, a deep, burning hatred in his eyes. I had not taken his throne. I had given it to the one person he considered his rival, the one person he could never control. It was a more profound humiliation than a direct challenge. Eleanor looked at Vera. "Ms. Kincaid, if appointed, what would be your first actions?" Vera stood. She didn't look at my father or at Pierce. She addressed the board as a whole. Her voice was calm, firm, and carried the weight of her years of service. "My first action will be to fully cooperate with the court-ordered investigation. My second will be to sign and implement the protection of service members policy that was drafted and illegally suppressed by the current leadership. My third," she paused and looked directly at me, "will be to sign a binding, permanent directive restoring full and sole intellectual property rights for Project Sentinel to its creator, Mara Ellison. We will clean this house, and we will restore our integrity, not as a slogan, but as a practice." It was a perfect, concise declaration. She had promised them stability, legality, and a solution to the immediate crisis I represented. She had offered them a way out. The vote was conducted by paper ballot, a strangely archaic ritual in this temple of technology. A clear acrylic box was placed in the center of the table. One by one, the 7 voting members of the board wrote their decision on a slip of paper, folded it, and walked the length of the table to drop it into the box. The only sound was the whisper of expensive shoes on the carpet, the scratch of a pen, and the soft, papery click as each ballot fell. It sounded like distant, dry rain. My father voted, Pierce Latham, as a non-voting officer, could only watch. I, as a non-board member, stood apart, an observer. When the last ballot was cast, Eleanor Vance and the corporate council retrieved the box. They unlocked it and unfolded the slips of paper, laying them out in 2 piles. The room held its breath. Eleanor looked up, her face impassive. "The result of the vote is 5-2. By a majority of the board, Conrad Ellison is hereby suspended from his duties as CEO. Vera Kincaid is appointed interim chief executive officer, effective immediately." The exhale in the room was almost silent, a collective release of pressure. Pierce Latham finally made his move. He shoved his chair back violently and made for the door, his face a mask of pure panic. He was halfway there when the boardroom doors hissed open from the outside. 2 uniformed city security officers stepped in, followed by a plainclothes detective who held up a badge and a thick warrant. "Pierce Latham?" the detective asked, his voice calm and authoritative. "You're under arrest. We have a warrant to search your person, your office, and to seize all your electronic devices in connection with an ongoing investigation into fraud and conspiracy." Pierce froze, his hand on the doorknob. His entire world had just collapsed in the space of 30 seconds. He looked back at my father, a wild, pleading look in his eyes. My father did not return his gaze. He simply stared ahead, a deposed king on a granite throne. As the officers led a stunned, silent Pierce from the room, I quietly spoke to my lawyer. "File the motion," I said. "Now." She nodded, already typing on her phone. "We're withdrawing the civil suit for personal damages," she announced to the room at large, and specifically to my father. "In its place, we have just filed a formal complaint with the District Attorney's Office and the Federal Department of Justice, citing evidence of public corruption, defense contract fraud, and violations of the False Claims Act. This is no longer a private matter, it is a federal case." I had taken his money, his power, and his freedom off the table. This was never about a settlement, it was about accountability. The board members began to disperse, talking in low, urgent tones, leaving a wide space around the head of the table where my father still sat. Vera walked over to me, shook my hand firmly, and said, "Thank you. Now let's get to work." Finally, only 2 people were left in the vast, silent room, me and my father. He stood up slowly, his movements stiff. He walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of me, for the first time in my life, standing straight and tall. I felt he was no longer taller than me, the towering figure of my childhood, the unimpeachable authority, was gone. In his place was just a man, an old man who had been defeated. His voice was a low, guttural whisper, filled with a venomous, personal rage. "You humiliated me," he hissed. "In front of them, in front of the world. You tore down everything I built." I looked into his eyes, a bottomless well of pride and fury, and I felt nothing, not hatred, not love, not even pity, just a vast, cold emptiness. The man who had raised me was a stranger. "I didn't," I replied, my voice as quiet as his, but devoid of his fire. "You trained me." I walked out of the boardroom and did not look back. The air in the hallway felt different, lighter. The oppressive weight of my father's authority had been lifted, leaving a vacuum that was quickly being filled by the urgent, hushed whispers of the remaining board members reorganizing their world. I took the elevator down, alone. The descent was silent, a smooth mechanical glide that felt like a decompression from the immense pressure of the past few days. The main lobby was a cavern of polished marble and quiet efficiency. Vera Kincaid was waiting for me near the security desk. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes held a look of profound, weary respect. In her hands, she held a slim file folder. She didn't offer platitudes or congratulations. Vera was a creature of action and results, and she held the results in her hand. "Mara," she said, her voice crisp. She opened the folder and presented me with 2 documents and a pen. As interim CEO, my first official act. The first document was a single page, a corporate directive. Its title was Immediate and Irrevocable Restoration of Intellectual Property Rights, Project Sentinel. It legally and formally returned everything to me, the code, the architecture, the patents pending. It undid in a single page the theft that had taken them a year to orchestrate. The second document was thicker. It was the policy Arthur Vance had shown me. Protection of intellectual property and employment status for active duty service members. At the bottom, in the space for the CEO's signature, was Vera's strong, clear autograph. It was already signed. It was already law at Aegis Meridian. All it needed was my counter-signature of acknowledgement. I took the pen. My hand was perfectly steady. There was no triumphant flourish, no surge of overwhelming joy. There was only a quiet, profound sense of rightness, of a broken equation being solved, of a corrupted line of code being deleted and rewritten correctly. The ink flowed from the pen. My signature, a dark, final stroke on the paper. I pushed the documents back to her. It was done. It was correct. As Vera placed the signed papers back into the folder, the doors of another elevator opened. My father stepped out. He was alone. His legal team had already abandoned him, likely off to calculate their final bill and distance themselves from a losing client. He looked older, smaller, diminished by the cavernous space of the lobby he had once commanded. He walked toward me, his steps measured, his face an unreadable mask. He stopped a few feet away. He looked at me, at Vera, at the file folder in her hands. He understood what had just transpired. His life's work was now in the hands of his rival, and his own creation, his daughter, had been the instrument of his downfall. He did not offer an apology. He did not rage. He did what he had always done when faced with a business defeat. He fell back on the empty rituals of the world he knew. He extended his right hand. It was not the gesture of a father reaching for his daughter. It was the reflexive, hollow gesture of a CEO concluding a hostile negotiation, a learned habit from 1,000 boardroom deals. It was a handshake meant to signal the end of hostilities, an agreement to move on. I looked at his outstretched hand, the hand that had taught me to catch a ball, that had rested on my shoulder at my mother's funeral, that had signed the order to ruin me. I hesitated for only a second, then I took it. The contact was brief, the grip firm and dry. In that single, fleeting moment of connection, the entire weight of my childhood pressed in. The pride, the disappointment, the desperate, unrequited need for his approval. It was a lifetime of unspoken history compressed into 1 second of cool, formal pressure, and then I let go. I released his hand, and with it, I released everything else. It was a clean, final severance. He said nothing. He simply turned. The doors of the elevator he had just exited were still open. Waiting. He walked back toward them, a solitary figure retreating from the field. He stepped inside. The brushed steel doors slid silently, inexorably shut, reflecting a distorted, fractured image of the lobby before closing completely. There was no sound, no music, just the soft, final click of the doors locking into place. He was gone. I turned and walked to the massive granite reception desk. I took the temporary visitor's badge from my pocket, the one they had issued me when I was a pariah, and placed it on the counter. The receptionist, a young woman who had studiously avoided my gaze for the past few days, now looked at me with wide, respectful eyes. She slid my old, useless card away and produced a new one. It was a senior executive card, with my picture, my name, and the highest level of security clearance. Vera had already authorized it. As my fingers closed around the new card, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from Councilman Miller. The message was succinct, a perfect summary of the day's political and corporate fallout. It read, "Contract renewed, clause added, name attached." They had saved the company. But on my terms, my name was now formally attached to the policy that would protect others from what had happened to me. I slid the phone back into my pocket and looked up. Before me, dominating the marble wall, was the company slogan. The 3 words that had seemed like such a bitter joke for so long. Integrity first. The blue light behind the steel letters seemed to glow a little brighter. They were no longer a lie. They were a promise. Newly forged and tested in fire, they were a standard to be met, a debt to be paid. For the first time, they felt true. I turned my back on the sign, on the lobby, on the entire building that had been the battleground for my life. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped outside. The Northcrest rain was still falling, a steady, cleansing drizzle. The sky was a uniform shade of gray, washing the city clean. I felt the cool drops on my face and hands. I thought of the red-inked summons I had received what felt like a lifetime ago. The paper that had started this war. Now, the rain was washing it all away. The anger, the betrayal, the fight. The sky was rinsing the ink from the page, leaving it blank. I walked down the stone steps and into the street, my new access card, a cool, solid weight in my pocket, and did not look back. Thank you for listening to this story. I'm curious, where in the world are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support it by hitting the hype button. It makes a huge difference.